Have you ever wondered why stories from thousands of years ago still feel familiar? Why the struggles of ancient heroes mirror our own challenges? Or why the conflicts between gods seem to reflect the complexities of human relationships we navigate every day? Tonight, we're going to take a gentle journey back in time, not to memorize names and dates, but to explore something deeper. We are going to discover how the ancient Greeks used storytelling to make sense of their world, and how those same stories continue to shape the way we understand ourselves. The mythology of ancient Greece isn't just a collection of old tales. It's a living archive of human experience, a repository of wisdom about love and loss, ambition and humility, the tension between fate and free will. These stories were told and retold for generations, each narrator adding their own interpretations, their own understanding of what it means to be human. What's remarkable is that these weren't considered fiction in the way we might think of fantasy today. For the ancient Greeks, these stories were explanations for the world they saw around them. Why does the sun rise and set? Why do the seasons change? Why do we suffer, love, hope, and dream? The myths provided answers, wrapped in narratives that captured both the imagination and the heart. As we move through this exploration together, you'll notice patterns emerging. The same themes appear again and again, woven through different stories, suggesting truths that transcend any single tale. The Greeks understood something profound about human nature, about the cycles of power, the consequences of pride, and the redemptive possibilities of wisdom gained through suffering. So settle in, let your mind wander back to a time when the line between mortal and divine seemed thin, when heroes walked the earth, and when every natural phenomenon told a story. This isn't just about ancient history. It's about the stories we still tell ourselves today. The Greeks had a poetic way of explaining how everything began. They didn't speak of scientific processes or mechanical causation. Instead, they described creation as an emergence from pure potential, from a state they called chaos. Imagine chaos not as disorder in the way we might use the word today, but as a vast, formless void. It was emptiness, yes, but emptiness pregnant with possibility. From this nothingness, the first entities came into being, not through anyone's action, but simply through the nature of existence itself seeking form. First came Gaia, the earth herself, solid and tangible. Then Eros, the force of love and attraction that draws things together. These weren't personalities in the way the later gods would be. They were more like fundamental forces, the building blocks from which everything else would emerge. What's beautiful about this creation story is its organic quality. There's no commanding deity speaking things into existence. Instead, creation unfolds naturally, each stage emerging from what came before. Day and night appear, establishing the fundamental rhythm that would govern all life. Tartarus forms in the depths, representing the dark spaces that balance the light. Gaia, representing the earth, then gave birth to Uranus, the sky. And here we see the first relationship, the first partnership that would set a pattern repeated throughout Greek mythology. The earth and sky united, and from their union came the Titans, beings of immense power who represented elemental forces of nature. Among these Titans were Oceanus, the great river encircling the world, and Hyperion, associated with the light of the sun. There was Themis, who embodied law and order, and Cronus, who would play a pivotal role in what came next. But this early creation wasn't peaceful. Uranus, despite being father to the Titans, feared their power. He imprisoned them within the earth, causing Gaia tremendous pain. This introduces one of mythology's recurring themes, the conflict between generations, the old fearing replacement by the new. Gaia, suffering from Uranus's cruelty, crafted a sickle from adamant, an indestructible substance, and gave it to Cronus, her youngest and boldest son. When Uranus next came to lie with Gaia, Cronus struck, severing his father's power and taking his place as ruler of the cosmos. From the blood of Uranus that fell into the sea, a new being emerged, Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Even in violence, the Greeks saw the potential for beauty to be born. It's a complex understanding of how the world works, acknowledging that creation and destruction are often intertwined. With Uranus deposed, Cronus became the ruler of the world, beginning what the Greeks called the Golden Age. But Cronus carried with him the weight of his violent rise to power. He had overthrown his father, and the fear that his own children might do the same to him consumed his thoughts. This is where mythology reveals something profound about human psychology. Power, once gained through violence or betrayal, brings with it perpetual anxiety. Those who rise through such means can never fully trust because they know what ambition is capable of. Cronus married his sister Rhea, and together they had 6 children who would become the first Olympian gods. But Cronus, haunted by a prophecy that one of his children would overthrow him just as he had overthrown Uranus, made a terrible decision. As each child was born, he swallowed them whole, trapping them in his stomach. Think about the symbolism here. A father so afraid of being replaced that he literally consumes his own children, preventing them from reaching their potential. It's a powerful metaphor for how fear can turn us against those we should nurture and protect. Rhea, watching child after child disappear into Cronus's maw, was devastated. When she became pregnant with her 6th child, Zeus, she knew she had to act. She gave birth in secret on the island of Crete, hiding the infant in a cave where he would be raised by nymphs and protected by loyal guardians. To deceive Cronus, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to her husband, who swallowed it without question, so consumed by his paranoia that he didn't even pause to look closely. Zeus grew to manhood in hiding, learning and preparing for the day he would challenge his father. When that day came, he returned to confront Cronus. Through a combination of cunning and power, Zeus forced his father to regurgitate his siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. The stone came up first, followed by each of the gods in reverse order of their swallowing. The liberation of the gods from Cronus's stomach wasn't the end of the conflict. It was only the beginning. What followed was the Titanomachy, a war between the old order of Titans and the new generation of Olympian gods. This war lasted 10 years, a detail that emphasizes its cosmic significance. The Greeks understood that fundamental change doesn't happen quickly or easily. Real transformation, whether in the cosmos or in human society, requires sustained effort, sacrifice, and often great cost. Zeus and his siblings weren't fighting alone. They sought allies among those who had been wronged by the Titans' rule. From deep within the earth, Zeus freed the Cyclopes, master craftsmen who had been imprisoned by Uranus and kept locked away by Cronus. In gratitude, these one-eyed giants forged weapons of incredible power. Zeus received his thunderbolt, Poseidon was given a trident that could shake the earth and command the seas, and Hades received a helmet of invisibility. These weren't just weapons. They were symbols of their bearers' domains and powers. Zeus's thunderbolt represented his authority over the sky and his ability to bring judgment. Poseidon's trident showed his mastery over the unpredictable forces of the sea. Hades's helmet spoke to his role as lord of the unseen realm of the dead. The war raged across the cosmos, with battles that shook the very foundations of the world. Finally, the Olympians prevailed. But victory brought the question of what to do with the defeated Titans. Zeus chose to imprison them in Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld, where they would remain for eternity. This raises an interesting question about power and mercy. Zeus could have destroyed the Titans entirely, but instead he imprisoned them. Perhaps this reflects an understanding that the old ways can never be completely erased, only contained and remembered. One Titan received a particularly memorable punishment. Atlas, who had led the Titan armies in battle, was condemned to hold up the sky on his shoulders for all time. Every day, every moment, bearing the weight of the heavens. It's an image of eternal responsibility, of a burden that can never be set down. Not all Titans suffered this fate. Themis, who represented divine law and order, had sided with Zeus during the war. Prometheus, whose name means forethought, had also supported the new order, recognizing perhaps that change was inevitable and necessary. After the war, the world needed to be reorganized. Zeus and his brothers drew lots to determine who would rule which realm. Zeus received the sky and became king of the gods. Poseidon was given dominion over the seas. Hades, drawing the shortest lot, became lord of the underworld, the realm of the dead. But the earth remained empty of the beings who would become central to so many myths: humanity. The Titan Prometheus, whose name meant forethought or planning ahead, looked at the world and saw it populated only by beasts, creatures driven by instinct with no capacity for reason or advancement. Prometheus decided to create something new. He shaped humans from clay, molding them in the image of the gods themselves. This was a bold act, suggesting that mortals shared something fundamental with the divine, even if they lacked immortality and power. But Prometheus wasn't content with simply creating humans and leaving them to struggle in darkness. He saw them huddling in caves, unable to defend themselves, living lives barely different from the animals around them. So he made a decision that would change everything. He stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. This wasn't just about warmth or the ability to cook food, though those were certainly important. Fire represented technology, progress, the capacity to transform the natural world. With fire, humans could forge tools, create art, establish civilization. Fire was the spark that would separate humanity from the animal kingdom. Zeus was furious when he discovered what Prometheus had done. The king of the gods saw this gift as a threat to the divine order. If humans had fire, what would stop them from advancing until they challenged the gods themselves? The punishment Zeus devised for Prometheus was cruel in its ingenuity. He had the Titan chained to a mountainside, where each day an eagle would come and consume his liver. Each night, because Prometheus was immortal, his liver would regenerate, only to be eaten again the following day. This cycle continued for thousands of years, a punishment designed to last forever. But Zeus wasn't finished. He wanted to punish humanity as well for receiving this forbidden gift. So he turned to Hephaestus, the divine craftsman, and asked him to create something that would bring suffering to mortals. Hephaestus crafted the first woman from clay, shaping her with divine skill. The gods gathered around to bestow gifts upon this new creation. Aphrodite gave her grace and beauty. Athene granted her cleverness and skill in weaving. Hermes provided her with speech and a curious nature. They named her Pandora, which means all gifts, because she had received something from each of the divine beings. But along with these gifts, Zeus gave Pandora something else, a sealed jar, sometimes described as a box in later retellings. He instructed her never to open it under any circumstances, without explaining what was inside. Then he sent her to Earth as a gift to Prometheus, the brother of Prometheus. Prometheus, whose name meant forethought, had warned his brother Prometheus, whose name meant afterthought, never to accept any gifts from Zeus. But Prometheus, true to his nature of acting before thinking, was captivated by Pandora's beauty and took her as his wife without hesitation. For a while, they lived happily together. But Pandora couldn't stop thinking about the jar. What could be so important that Zeus himself had commanded it must never be opened? Her curiosity grew day by day, fed by the gift Hermes had given her, until finally she could resist no longer. She lifted the lid just a crack, intending only to peek inside. But the moment she did, a dark cloud erupted from the jar. Out poured all the evils that would plague humanity for the rest of time: disease and old age, envy and spite, hardship and toil, sorrow and death. These afflictions spread across the world, bringing an end to the golden age when humans lived without suffering. Pandora, horrified at what she had done, slammed the lid shut. But it was too late. Almost everything had escaped. Only one thing remained trapped inside the jar: hope. Think about the complexity of this myth. Zeus knew Pandora would open the jar. That's why he gave her curiosity. The punishment was designed from the beginning to unfold exactly as it did. But why did hope remain inside? Was it trapped there to be preserved, or was it imprisoned to be kept from humanity? The Greeks offered different interpretations. Some said hope remained in the jar as humanity's one comfort, the thing that would help them endure all the other evils now in the world. Others suggested that hope, too, was a kind of evil, a delusion that keeps people striving even when the situation is hopeless. Perhaps the truth is somewhere in between. Hope can sustain us through hardship, but it can also blind us to reality. The myth doesn't provide a simple answer, and maybe that's the point. Life's greatest questions rarely have simple answers. With evil now loose in the world, humanity began to change. The Greeks divided human history into ages, each one representing a decline from the perfection that came before. After the Golden Age came the Silver Age, and then the Bronze Age, when humans became obsessed with war and violence. Zeus looked down from Olympus and saw a world consumed by conflict and cruelty. Humans had stopped honoring the gods, had abandoned the principles of justice and hospitality that should govern civilized life. They fought and murdered each other for petty reasons, showing no respect for the divine order. The king of the gods decided that humanity was beyond redemption. He would wipe the slate clean and start over. He asked his brother Poseidon to gather his strength and strike the depths of the ocean with his mighty trident. The resulting wave was so massive it eclipsed the tallest mountains. Rain poured from the heavens as winds lashed the waters into a frenzy. Cities were swallowed whole. Those who managed to survive the initial deluge eventually succumbed to starvation as the waters continued to rise, covering every piece of dry land. But there were two survivors, and their survival wasn't by chance. Prometheus, still chained to his mountain, but able to see what was coming, managed to warn his son Deucalion and Deucalion's wife Pyrrha, who was the daughter of Pandora and Epimetheus. Following Prometheus's instructions, they built a sturdy vessel and stocked it with supplies. When the flood came, their little boat rode out the storm, drifting alone in the vast, empty ocean while the world they knew disappeared beneath the waves. For days they sailed, seeing nothing but water in all directions. They mourned for their fellow humans, for the civilization that had been lost. But eventually they spotted land, the peak of Mount Parnassus, the only place the waters hadn't completely consumed. As the waters receded and the earth became calm again, Deucalion and Pyrrha found themselves in a world cleansed of human life. They were alone, the last of their kind, standing on an empty earth. They prayed to the gods for guidance. How could two people repopulate an entire world? The Titan Themis, who represented divine law, appeared to them with strange instructions. They were to walk along the mountain, throwing stones over their shoulders as they went, without looking back. It was an odd command, but they had learned to trust divine guidance. Deucalion and Pyrrha walked the mountain paths, picking up stones and tossing them behind them. And as each stone hit the ground, it began to transform. The stones thrown by Deucalion became men. Those thrown by Pyrrha became women. This is how humanity was born again, formed from the bones of the earth itself. These new humans had no memory of the crimes that led to the flood. They were given a fresh start, an opportunity to build a better world than the one that had been destroyed. It's a story about second chances, about how destruction can lead to renewal. But it's also a warning. The flood showed that the gods were willing to start over if humanity strayed too far from the path of righteousness. The question left hanging is, will this new humanity learn from the mistakes of those who came before? With the world restored and humanity given a second chance, the gods established themselves on Mount Olympus, the highest peak in Greece, where they would rule over mortals and monsters alike. The 12 Olympians, as they came to be known, each took responsibility for different aspects of existence. This wasn't arbitrary. It reflected the Greek understanding that the world was complex, that different forces governed different domains, and that balance required multiple perspectives and powers. Zeus, as king of the gods, ruled the sky and served as the arbiter of justice. His thunderbolt represented his power to bring punishment or blessing, to shake the world or maintain its stability. He was associated with hospitality and the protection of guests, because the Greeks believed that any stranger might be a god in disguise, testing mortals' adherence to civilized behavior. Hera, Zeus's wife and queen of the gods, presided over marriage and family. Her relationship with Zeus was notoriously troubled, marked by his constant infidelities and her jealous vengeance. But rather than seeing this as simply melodrama, we might understand it as the Greeks' acknowledgement that even sacred institutions like marriage are complicated, subject to betrayal and conflict. Poseidon commanded the seas, and his temperament reflected the ocean itself, sometimes calm and generous, other times violent and unpredictable. Sailors would pray to Poseidon before voyages, hoping for smooth waters, knowing that his mood could determine their fate. Hades ruled the underworld, a role that made him feared but not evil. The Greeks didn't conceive of their afterlife in the same way as modern heaven and hell. The underworld was simply where souls went after death, and Hades was its administrator, ensuring that the natural order was maintained. Athene, born fully grown from Zeus's forehead, represented wisdom and strategic warfare. Unlike Ares, who reveled in battle's chaos, Athene favored clever tactics and just causes. She was the patron of Athens, the intellectual heart of ancient Greece, and embodied the Greek ideal of wisdom tempered by practical knowledge. Apollo, god of light, music, and prophecy, represented order and reason. His oracle at Delphi was consulted by kings and commoners alike, seeking glimpses of the future or guidance for difficult decisions. The prophecies were often ambiguous, teaching that knowledge of the future doesn't necessarily give us control over it. Artemis, Apollo's twin sister, was goddess of the hunt and the moon. She represented the wild spaces, the untamed nature that existed outside civilization's boundaries. A perpetual virgin, she embodied independence and self-sufficiency. Aphrodite, born from the sea foam that formed around Uranus's severed genitals, was the goddess of love and beauty. Her power extended over both gods and mortals, because the Greeks understood that desire and attraction were forces that could override reason and duty. Hephaestus, the divine craftsman, was physically impaired, marked by a limp that came from being thrown from Olympus. Despite, or perhaps because of this, he created objects of incredible beauty and power. His workshop beneath volcanoes produced the weapons and treasures of the gods. Ares represented the brutal, chaotic side of war. Unlike Athene's strategic approach, Ares embodied bloodlust and violence for its own sake. He was widely disliked, even among the gods, suggesting the Greeks' ambivalent relationship with warfare, necessary sometimes but never to be glorified. Demeter governed agriculture and the harvest, making her essential to human survival. Her moods affected the fertility of the earth, and her grief would later bring about the seasons. Finally, Hermes served as messenger of the gods, patron of travelers and thieves, guide of souls to the underworld. His ability to move between realms made him uniquely suited to facilitate communication between the divine and mortal worlds. The gods of Olympus weren't distant, abstract entities. They had personalities, emotions, desires, and conflicts. They fell in love, felt jealousy, sought revenge, and made mistakes. In this way, they served as a mirror for human nature, elevated to cosmic scale. Zeus's numerous affairs provide a prime example. Despite being married to Hera, he constantly pursued other women, both mortal and divine. He would transform himself into various forms to seduce his targets: a swan for Leda, a shower of gold for Danae, a bull for Europa. These weren't just stories about divine lust. They reflected Greek observations about power and desire, about how those in positions of authority often felt entitled to act on their impulses regardless of consequences. Zeus's infidelities also produced many of the heroes who would populate later myths, creating complicated family trees that connected the divine and human realms. Hera's response to these affairs was usually not to blame Zeus directly, but to punish the women he pursued and the children they bore. From a modern perspective, this seems unjust. Why blame the victims of Zeus's advances? But the myths reflect the reality of ancient Greek society, where women often bore the consequences of powerful men's actions. Consider the story of Io, a priestess of Hera who caught Zeus's eye. When Hera discovered them together, Zeus transformed Io into a white cow to protect her. But Hera, knowing what had happened, demanded the cow as a gift and set the hundred-eyed monster Argus to guard it, ensuring Io couldn't escape. Zeus eventually sent Hermes to rescue Io, but even after her liberation, Hera sent a gadfly to torment her, driving her across the known world in a desperate attempt to find peace. The seas she crossed were named after her, the Ionian Sea, the Bosporus, which means Ford of the Cow. These myths about divine relationships contained lessons for mortals. They showed that even the gods struggled with jealousy and betrayal, that power didn't protect one from emotional pain, that actions had consequences that rippled outward, affecting many beyond those directly involved. The story of Prometheus's punishment, revisited, takes on additional meaning in this context. He suffered not just for stealing fire, but for showing loyalty to humanity over the gods. His torment lasted for thousands of years until Heracles finally freed him, suggesting that even the gods' punishments couldn't last forever, that mercy and compassion could eventually triumph over vengeance. If the gods represented cosmic forces and eternal patterns, the heroes of Greek mythology represented humanity at its best and worst. They were usually demigods, born from unions between gods and mortals, giving them extraordinary abilities but also human vulnerabilities. The hero's story typically followed a pattern that the scholar Joseph Campbell would later identify as the monomyth or hero's journey. A person of humble or uncertain origins receives a call to adventure. They face trials and challenges, often with divine assistance. They descend into darkness, literally or metaphorically, and emerge transformed, bringing back wisdom or treasure to benefit their community. Perseus offers a classic example. Born to the mortal Danae and Zeus, who had visited her as a shower of gold, Perseus was locked in a chest with his mother and cast into the sea by his grandfather, who feared a prophecy that his grandson would kill him. They survived, washing up on the island of Seriphos, where Perseus grew to manhood. But the island's king desired Danae and saw Perseus as an obstacle. So he challenged the young man to bring back the head of Medusa, certain this impossible task would result in Perseus's death. Medusa's story itself deserves attention. She hadn't always been a monster. Once she was a beautiful woman, a priestess of Athene. But Poseidon desired her and violated her in Athene's temple. Rather than punish Poseidon, Athene transformed Medusa into a creature so hideous that anyone who looked at her would turn to stone. This transformation raises uncomfortable questions about justice and victimhood. Medusa suffered twice, first from Poseidon's assault, then from Athene's punishment for something beyond her control. Her story became a cautionary tale, but who exactly was being warned and about what? Perseus, aided by divine gifts, a mirrored shield from Athene, winged sandals from Hermes, a sword from Hephaestus, managed to approach Medusa while she slept. Looking only at her reflection in his shield, he cut off her head, which retained its petrifying power even after her death. From Medusa's severed neck sprang Pegasus, the winged horse who had been growing inside her since Poseidon's assault. Even in death and transformation, life finds a way to emerge, though perhaps not in the forms we expect. If Perseus represents the hero who succeeds through divine assistance and clever tactics, Heracles represents something different, the hero who must prove himself through sheer strength and endurance, who must earn redemption through suffering. Heracles was the son of Zeus and Alcmene, a mortal woman. This made him the focus of Hera's jealous rage from birth. The queen of the gods attempted to kill him multiple times, first sending serpents to his cradle, which the infant Heracles strangled with his bare hands. But Hera's most terrible vengeance came later, after Heracles had married and had children. She struck him with madness, causing him to see his own family as monsters. In his deluded state, he killed his wife and children, the people he loved most in the world. When the madness lifted and Heracles realized what he had done, his grief was overwhelming. This wasn't an enemy he could defeat with strength. This was guilt, a burden that couldn't be lifted or fought against in traditional ways. He sought guidance from the oracle of Delphi, who told him that to atone for his crimes, he must serve King Eurystheus for 12 years, completing whatever labors the king demanded. This was a profound humiliation for the strongest man alive, to serve a lesser man, to have his strength commanded by someone else. The 12 labors of Heracles tested him in different ways. Some required physical strength, like wrestling the Nemean lion, whose hide was impervious to weapons, or cleaning the Augean stables in a single day. Others tested his courage, like facing the multi-headed Hydra or capturing Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guarded the gates of the underworld. But several labors also tested his cleverness and perseverance. To complete them, Heracles had to think, to plan, to use tools and strategy rather than relying solely on strength. He diverted rivers to clean the stables. He used a friend's help to cauterize the Hydra's necks and prevent new heads from growing. He tricked Atlas into retrieving the golden apples of the Hesperides. What makes Heracles' story compelling isn't just his strength. It's his willingness to accept the consequences of his actions, to submit to punishment even though he could have overpowered Eurystheus easily. It's his persistence through years of difficult, often degrading tasks, driven by the need to make amends for an unforgivable crime. The tragedy is that even after completing his labors and being granted forgiveness, Heracles couldn't escape suffering. Years later, he would die in agony, poisoned by his own wife who had been tricked into thinking she was saving their marriage. But the gods took pity on him, bringing him to Olympus and granting him immortality, recognizing that his suffering and redemption had earned him a place among the divine. All the previous myths, all the heroes and their adventures were building toward the greatest story in Greek mythology, the Trojan War. This wasn't just a conflict between two cities. It was the culmination of divine interference in mortal affairs, a war that would mark the end of the Age of Heroes. The war's origins trace back to a wedding that should have been a celebration. Peleus, a mortal hero, was marrying Thetis, a sea goddess. The gods were invited to attend, all except one, Eris, the goddess of discord, who was universally disliked for her troublemaking nature. Offended at being excluded, Eris decided to cause chaos. She created a golden apple inscribed with the words, "To the fairest," and threw it into the wedding celebration. Immediately, three goddesses claimed it: Hera, Athene, and Aphrodite. Unable to decide among themselves and unwilling to let Zeus make the choice, knowing he wouldn't want to anger any of them, they selected a mortal to judge. That mortal was Paris, a prince of Troy who had been raised as a shepherd after his parents received a prophecy that he would bring destruction to their city. Each goddess offered Paris a bribe. Hera promised political power. Athene offered military might and glory. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. Paris chose Aphrodite, setting in motion events that would lead to a 10-year war and the fall of Troy. It's worth pausing to consider what this choice represents. Paris chose personal desire over power or glory, love over ambition. In many stories, this might be portrayed as noble. But Paris's choice ignored the fact that Helen was already married, that his desire would cause suffering to many others. When Paris traveled to Sparta, and with Aphrodite's help, convinced Helen to return with him to Troy, he violated one of the most sacred bonds in Greek society: the hospitality between guest and host. Menelaus had welcomed Paris into his home, and Paris repaid this kindness by stealing his wife. This violation required a response. Menelaus called upon all of Helen's former suitors, who had sworn an oath to defend whichever man she chose to marry. Kings and heroes from across Greece assembled a massive fleet to sail to Troy and retrieve Helen. The Trojan War lasted 10 years, a decade of death and destruction over a single woman. But to the Greeks, it wasn't really about Helen. It was about honor, about oath-keeping, about the principles that held civilization together. The war gave rise to some of mythology's most memorable characters. Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived, was nearly invulnerable. His mother had dipped him in the river Styx as an infant, making his body impenetrable everywhere except the heel by which she held him. Achilles embodied the warrior's paradox. He knew before the war began that he had a choice: live a long, peaceful life and be forgotten, or die young in battle and achieve eternal glory. He chose glory, but the cost of that choice haunted him throughout the war. His counterpart on the Trojan side was Hector, who fought not for glory but for duty. Hector was a devoted son, a loving husband, and a responsible prince. He didn't want war, but he fought to protect his city and his family. The scene where he says goodbye to his wife and infant son, knowing he might not return, is one of the most poignant in all of Greek mythology. Odysseus, known for his cunning rather than his strength, represented a different kind of heroism. While Achilles and Hector proved themselves through martial prowess, Odysseus survived through wit and adaptability. It would be his idea, the Trojan horse, that would ultimately win the war when strength alone had failed. The gods, too, took sides in the conflict. Aphrodite supported the Trojans, having promised Helen to Paris. Athene and Hera, still bitter about not being chosen, favored the Greeks. The war became a proxy conflict for divine disputes, with mortal warriors serving as pieces in a cosmic game. But the war's most important lesson wasn't about military strategy or divine favor. It was about the cost of pride and the tragedy of conflict. Both sides lost their greatest heroes. Families were destroyed. An entire city was razed to the ground. And for what? Because a prince chose love over wisdom, because heroes valued glory over life, because the gods couldn't settle their disputes without involving mortals. After 10 years of siege warfare, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage, Odysseus proposed his famous stratagem. The Greeks would build a massive wooden horse as a supposed offering to the gods, then sail away, making it appear they had given up the siege. The Trojans, seeing the Greek ships departing and finding the enormous horse outside their gates, debated what to do. Some argued for caution, for burning the horse without bringing it inside the walls. The priest Laocoon warned them, speaking the famous words, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts." But the Trojans' desire to believe the war was over, combined with the manipulations of Greek spies, led them to bring the horse inside. That night, Greek warriors hidden in the horse's belly emerged and opened the gates from within, allowing their returning army to flood into the city. What followed was a massacre. Troy burned. King Priam was killed at his own altar. Hector's infant son was thrown from the city walls to prevent him from one day seeking revenge. The women of Troy were distributed as war prizes among the Greek victors. The sack of Troy represented the dark side of heroic warfare. These weren't glorious duels between matched warriors. This was the brutal reality of ancient conflict. Cities destroyed, civilians murdered, survivors enslaved. The myths don't shy away from this darkness, forcing us to confront what victory actually cost. But the war's end didn't bring peace to the victors. The journey home would prove as treacherous as the war itself. Agamemnon, commander of the Greek forces, returned home only to be murdered by his wife, who had never forgiven him for sacrificing their daughter to obtain favorable winds for the fleet. Others, like Ajax, were lost at sea, struck down by the gods for their arrogance and impiety. The gods, it seemed, had grown tired of the war and its heroes, ready to punish even those who had fought on their favored side. Odysseus's journey back to Ithaca would take 10 years, the same length as the war itself. His Odyssey became a story unto itself, one that has influenced countless adventure narratives in the millennia since it was first told. What makes Odysseus's journey compelling is that his trials were different from those he faced in war. In battle, he could rely on his intelligence to devise tactics and strategies. But on the journey home, he faced challenges that couldn't be defeated through cleverness alone, though he certainly tried. He encountered the lotus eaters, whose plant-induced forgetfulness and contentment, tempting his men to abandon their desire to return home. He blinded the Cyclops Polyphemus, but his pride in revealing his true name led to Poseidon's curse, ensuring his journey would be long and painful. He resisted the song of the sirens by having himself tied to his ship's mast, able to hear their beautiful music without being able to act on the desire to join them. He navigated between Scylla and Charybdis, choosing to sacrifice some of his crew rather than risk losing everyone. But perhaps his most difficult trials came from the gods' interference. Circe transformed his men into pigs. Calypso held him captive for 7 years, offering him immortality if he would stay with her forever. Each time, Odysseus had to find a way forward, sometimes through cleverness, sometimes through endurance, sometimes through divine assistance. What's remarkable about Odysseus is his persistence. Lesser men would have given up, would have accepted Calypso's offer of immortality and eternal youth. But Odysseus clung to his desire to return home, to see his wife Penelope again, to reclaim his place in the world he knew. When he finally reached Ithaca after 20 years away, he couldn't simply walk into his palace and reclaim his throne. His home had been overrun by suitors hoping to marry Penelope and take his kingdom. He had to prove himself one final time, disguised as a beggar, before he could reveal his true identity. The contest Penelope set, to string Odysseus's old bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads, served multiple purposes. It tested physical strength, yes, but also skill and familiarity with a specific object. Only Odysseus could accomplish it, proving his identity in a way that couldn't be faked. As we come to the end of our journey through Greek mythology, it's worth reflecting on what these ancient stories offer us today, thousands of years after they were first told. The Greeks didn't separate their myths from their understanding of the world. These stories explained natural phenomena, why the seasons change, why crops grow, why storms arise. But they also explored deeper questions about human nature, morality, fate, and free will. The myths acknowledge that life is complicated, that there are rarely simple answers to important questions. The gods themselves are complex characters, capable of both great kindness and terrible cruelty. Heroes make mistakes, often catastrophic ones, and must live with the consequences. Consider the recurring theme of prophecy and fate. Characters throughout these stories receive prophecies about their futures, usually prophecies of doom. And nearly every time, their attempts to avoid the prophecy are precisely what cause it to come true. King Laius abandoned his infant son Oedipus to prevent the prophecy that his son would kill him. But this act set in motion the events that led to Oedipus unknowingly fulfilling that very prophecy. The lesson isn't that we can't escape fate, but perhaps that trying to avoid our fears often creates the very outcomes we sought to prevent. The myths also explore the complexity of justice and punishment. Prometheus suffered terribly for giving fire to humanity, but from humanity's perspective, he was a benefactor, not a criminal. Medusa was punished for being victimized. Heracles had to atone for murders he committed while mad, even though he wasn't in control of his actions. These aren't simple stories with clear morals. They reflect the messy reality of life, where good people suffer, where the innocent are punished, where noble intentions lead to terrible outcomes. The Greeks didn't try to simplify these contradictions. They incorporated them into their mythology, creating a rich tapestry of stories that acknowledged life's complexity. One of the most interesting aspects of Greek mythology is the relationship between gods and mortals. Unlike in some religious traditions where the divine is completely separate from the human, in Greek myths, the two realms constantly intersect. Gods fall in love with mortals. Heroes are often demigods, children of divine and human parents. Mortals can earn a place among the gods through exceptional deeds. The boundaries are permeable, suggesting that the Greeks saw divinity not as something completely other, but as an extension or elevation of qualities that exist in humanity. But this closeness comes with dangers. The gods are capricious, their favor uncertain. They demand respect and worship, and punish those who slight them with terrible severity. The story of Niobe, who boasted that she was superior to the goddess Leto because she had more children, ended with all of Niobe's children dead, struck down by Leto's offspring Apollo and Artemis. Pride, hubris in Greek, is perhaps the most consistently punished trait in mythology. Arachne boasted she was a better weaver than Athene, and was transformed into a spider. Bellerophon tried to fly to Olympus and was thrown back to earth, blinded and alone. Tantalus served his own son to the gods as food and was condemned to eternal hunger and thirst in the underworld. The message is clear: know your place. Humans can aspire to greatness, can achieve remarkable things, but they must remember their mortality, their limitations. To forget this, to compare oneself to the gods, is to invite disaster. Yet the myths also celebrate humans who achieve extraordinary things while maintaining proper humility. Odysseus succeeded not just because he was clever, but because he recognized when he needed divine help and accepted it. Perseus accomplished his impossible task by accepting gifts from the gods rather than trying to succeed through his own power alone. Greek mythology contains some of the most poignant love stories ever told, but they're rarely happy ones. Love in these myths is often transformative, sometimes literally, and it frequently comes with a terrible cost. Orpheus, the legendary musician whose songs could charm even stones, lost his beloved wife Eurydice to a snake bite on their wedding day. Overcome with grief, he did what no mortal was supposed to do. He descended into the underworld to bring her back. His music was so beautiful that it moved Hades and Persephone to pity. They agreed to let Eurydice return to life on one condition: Orpheus must walk ahead of her on the way out and not look back until they both reached the surface. If he looked back even once, she would be lost to him forever. They began the long climb from the underworld, Orpheus in front, Eurydice following behind. As they neared the exit and sunlight appeared ahead, Orpheus was overcome with doubt. Was Eurydice really behind him? Had the gods tricked him? Unable to resist, he turned to look. For one brief moment, he saw her reaching toward him. Then she faded away, drawn back to the underworld, lost to him forever. This time, there would be no second chance. It's a story about trust and doubt, about how love sometimes requires faith, even when we can't see or verify what we hope is true. Orpheus's failure wasn't due to lack of love. He loved Eurydice so much he braved death itself for her. He failed because he couldn't trust, couldn't maintain faith in that final crucial moment. Other love stories in Greek mythology end in transformation. Daphne, fleeing from Apollo's pursuit, was changed into a laurel tree. Narcissus, rejecting all who loved him, fell in love with his own reflection and was transformed into a flower. Echo, cursed to only repeat others' words, wasted away until only her voice remained. These transformations suggest that love changes us, sometimes in ways we can't control or reverse. The passionate become plants, the vain become flowers, the devoted become eternal but voiceless echoes. It's a more complex understanding of love than simple romance. Love as a force that reshapes reality itself. The myth of Demeter and Persephone offers one of the most beautiful explanations for the changing seasons, while also exploring themes of loss, compromise, and the relationship between mothers and daughters. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, had a daughter named Persephone whom she loved more than anything. But Hades, lonely in his underground kingdom, desired Persephone as his wife. With Zeus's permission, he emerged from the earth while Persephone was picking flowers and dragged her down to his realm. Demeter's grief, when she discovered her daughter was gone, was all-consuming. She abandoned her duties, and without her attention, crops failed, leaves withered, and the world began to starve. Nothing would grow because the goddess of growth was too heartbroken to care for the earth. Zeus, seeing humanity on the brink of extinction, ordered Hades to return Persephone. But Hades was clever. Before releasing her, he offered Persephone pomegranate seeds, the food of the dead. She ate just a few, but it was enough to bind her to the underworld forever. A compromise was reached. Persephone would spend part of each year with her mother in the world above, and part with Hades in the world below. When she returns to her mother, Demeter's joy causes spring to bloom and summer to flourish. When Persephone descends to the underworld, Demeter's grief brings autumn and winter. This myth does more than explain the seasons. It explores the painful reality that children must eventually leave their parents, that growth requires separation. Persephone's story is about the transition from maiden to woman, from daughter to wife, a journey that often involves leaving the familiar world of childhood behind. The pomegranate seeds represent the irreversibility of certain choices. Once Persephone ate the food of the dead, she could never fully return to the innocent life she had before. But the compromise, splitting her time between two worlds, suggests that we can honor both who we were and who we're becoming, that we don't have to completely abandon one identity to embrace another. The Trojan War marked the end of the Age of Heroes. After that great conflict, the gods gradually withdrew from direct involvement in mortal affairs. The time of demigods and legendary quests was drawing to a close. Zeus, we are told, had orchestrated the war partly to thin the ranks of the heroes, to create more distance between the divine and human realms. Too many demigods walked the earth, too many mortals claimed divine ancestry. The war served to kill off many of these exceptional individuals and discourage the gods from continuing to produce half-divine children. After the war, the survivors found that the world had changed. The old certainties no longer held. Agamemnon, the victorious commander, returned home only to be murdered by his wife. The very act of victory couldn't protect him from the consequences of his earlier choices, sacrificing his daughter, taking Cassandra as a concubine. Odysseus spent 10 more years trying to get home, facing trials that tested him in ways the war never had. When he finally returned to Ithaca, he found his kingdom barely recognizable, overrun by men who assumed he was dead and sought to take his place. The message is clear: there is no returning to the way things were. The world moves on. Time changes everything. The heroes who survived discovered that survival itself wasn't enough. They had to adapt to a new world, one where the old heroic values of glory and honor competed with newer concerns about wisdom, patience, and domestic peace. This transition from the age of heroes to the age of iron, the current age of humanity in Greek mythology, represents a maturation of sorts. The spectacular, larger-than-life adventures gave way to more mundane concerns: governance, agriculture, trade, philosophy. Humans would have to rely on their own abilities rather than hoping for divine intervention. Greek mythology wasn't just entertainment for the ancient Greeks. These stories served multiple functions in their society, providing religious meaning, moral instruction, cultural identity, and explanations for natural phenomena. The myths were told and retold, performed in theaters, depicted in art, invoked in political speeches. They were a shared language that all Greeks understood, regardless of which city-state they came from. When an Athenian and a Spartan met, They might be political enemies, but they both knew the story of Odysseus, both honored Zeus, both understood what it meant to commit hubris. But the myths weren't static. Each retelling could emphasize different aspects, draw out different lessons. Homer's version of Achilles emphasized his rage and martial prowess. Later authors might focus more on his relationship with Patroclus, or his choice between a long, peaceful life and a short, glorious one. This flexibility is part of what has kept these stories alive for thousands of years. They're not dogmatic religious texts that must be interpreted in only one way. They're narratives rich enough to support multiple interpretations, to speak to different concerns in different eras. Today, we still reference these myths constantly, often without realizing it. We call a long, difficult journey an odyssey. We describe an impossible task as Herculean. Someone obsessed with their appearance is narcissistic. An insurmountable weakness is an Achilles heel. These phrases have entered our language because the stories they reference still resonate. We continue to find meaning in Orpheus's backward glance, in Pandora's forbidden box, in Icarus flying too close to the sun. These aren't just ancient stories. They're patterns that repeat in human experience, archetypes that help us understand our own lives and choices. As we near the end of our journey through these ancient myths, it's worth considering what it means that these stories have survived for so long. The Greek myths we know today were already ancient by the time Homer composed the Iliad and the Odyssey around 700 BCE. They had been passed down orally for generations before anyone wrote them down, evolving with each retelling. Different poets, playwrights, and philosophers would take these core stories and adapt them to explore the concerns of their own time. Sophocles used the story of Oedipus to examine questions of fate versus free will, of how we respond when we discover terrible truths about ourselves. Euripides' version of Medea explored the rage of a woman betrayed and the terrible lengths revenge can drive us to. The myths were never meant to be historically accurate accounts of events. The Greeks themselves debated which parts of their mythology might be based on real events and which were purely symbolic. But this question of literal truth versus metaphorical truth was less important to them than what we might expect. What mattered was that the stories conveyed truth about human nature, about how the world works, about the relationship between the human and divine realms. Whether Heracles literally performed 12 specific labors was less important than what his story taught about redemption, about how we atone for terrible mistakes, about how suffering can lead to transformation. This is perhaps the most important lesson the Greek myths offer us, that stories don't have to be literally true to be deeply meaningful. The best stories reveal truths that can't be expressed in simple factual statements. They work on multiple levels simultaneously, as entertainment, as moral instruction, as exploration of complex emotional and psychological states. Throughout these stories, certain themes emerge repeatedly, suggesting the Greeks' understanding of fundamental truths about existence. The tension between fate and free will appear in nearly every major myth. Characters receive prophecies about their futures, and their attempts to avoid these predicted outcomes often bring them about. Yet the myths don't present this as simple determinism. Characters still make choices, still exercise agency, even when those choices lead them toward the very fate they sought to escape. This paradox suggests a sophisticated understanding. We have free will, but our choices are shaped by our nature, our circumstances, our past. We can't fully escape who we are or where we come from, but we still bear responsibility for our actions. The danger of pride appears even more consistently. Character after character falls because they forget their limitations, because they compare themselves to the gods or believe themselves exempt from consequences. But humility alone isn't enough. The myths also celebrate excellence, achievement, the drive to do great things. The key is balance. Pursue greatness while remembering you're mortal. The complexity of justice is another recurring theme. The myths rarely present simple cases of good versus evil. Characters who commit terrible acts often have understandable motivations. Victims sometimes become victimizers. The innocent suffer while the guilty escape. The gods themselves don't always act justly, at least not by human standards. This moral complexity might seem troubling, but it reflects reality more accurately than myths that present a black and white moral universe. The Greeks understood that life is complicated, that good people sometimes do bad things, that suffering isn't always deserved, that justice doesn't always prevail. Every story must end, and our journey through Greek mythology is drawing to a close. But endings in Greek myths are rarely simple conclusions. They're transformations, transitions, new beginnings disguised as finales. The heroes of the Trojan War returned home to find their world changed. Some, like Agamemnon, were destroyed by that change. Others, like Odysseus, adapted and rebuilt. The choice between rigidly clinging to the past and flowing with change appears throughout these stories. Even death wasn't always an ending in Greek mythology. Heracles died in agony but was reborn as a god. Psyche died but was revived and granted immortality. Achilles chose a short, glorious life over a long, peaceful one, and his fame has indeed lasted for millennia. These transformations suggest that the Greeks understood something profound about change and continuity. We are constantly ending one phase of life and beginning another. The child becomes the adult. The innocent becomes the experienced. The hero becomes the legend. Each transition involves a kind of death, the death of who we were, but also the birth of who we are becoming. The myths themselves have undergone countless transformations over the millennia. They've been retold in new languages, adapted to new mediums, reinterpreted for new audiences. The specific details change, but the core patterns remain recognizable. This is perhaps the most hopeful message these ancient stories offer, that some things endure. Human nature, in its complexity and contradiction, its capacity for both nobility and cruelty, remains recognizable across vast expanses of time. The questions the Greeks asked about justice, fate, love, death, meaning are still the questions we ask today. As we conclude our exploration of Greek mythology, we find ourselves back where we began, considering why these ancient stories still speak to us. The myths don't offer easy answers or simple comfort. They acknowledge that life is difficult, that suffering is real, that death is inevitable. But they also celebrate the human capacity for courage, cleverness, love, and perseverance in the face of these challenges. They remind us that we are part of a long story, that humans have been asking the same fundamental questions for thousands of years. Each generation must grapple anew with questions of meaning, purpose, morality, and mortality. The specific circumstances change, but the underlying patterns remain constant. The Greek myths also demonstrate the power of storytelling itself. These stories have survived because they capture something essential about human experience, something that can't be reduced to simple principles or facts. They work on the imagination, on the emotions, on the part of us that responds to narrative and symbol. In a world increasingly dominated by data and facts, by measurable outcomes and provable assertions, there's something valuable about engaging with stories that operate on a different level. The myths remind us that not all truth can be quantified, that some of the most important aspects of human existence, love, grief, hope, meaning, resist simple categorization. As you go forward from this exploration, you might find yourself noticing echoes of these ancient patterns in modern stories, in your own life, in the news of the day. The hero's journey still resonates. The warnings against hubris still apply. The complexity of justice still challenges us. The Greeks didn't have all the answers, they weren't trying to. But they asked the right questions, and they asked them in a way that has continued to inspire, challenge, and move people for thousands of years. That perhaps is the greatest testament to the enduring power of their mythology. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the ancient world. May these timeless stories continue to echo in your thoughts, reminding you of the patterns that connect us across time, the questions that unite all humanity, and the power of stories to illuminate the deepest truths of our existence.